Yo, what's up everybody? Thanks for checking out the video. Today I wanted to record something, just kind of basically getting everything set up for some other videos I wanted to do, but first thing I wanted to set up was these stances and invocations that are in the game. So I made a little bit of a spreadsheet that I can show for you guys here, and showing which classes get what stances in the orange and what invocations that they're going to get in the blue. Just to kind of give, I think this is like pretty core mechanic that's across all the different classes that you're going to be using a lot. And I found that I dialed my character trio in, based on a couple different things, but this was like an underlying factor that all of them use, and knowing which one I wanted to use for my combo in a given situation really kind of helped. But I did some playtesting with it during the pre-order and learned some stuff, so I kind of wanted to just share some of that with you so that when you're playing, hopefully if you might learn something, or at least be able to see kind of what my experience was when I was using this stuff. So basically, to get into it, I'll leave this up a lot, but I'm going to cross-reference a couple things here. So specifically, I wanted to go over what all of these things were for us, so kind of give an understanding, read through it, and then also talk a little bit more than what the EQL wiki says specifically that I saw in-game, how it was working. So it, just minor little things, but this is a great resource, EQL wiki. And so the first one up on their list here is this balance stance. So it says all incoming damage is reduced by 10% and your chance to hit is increased by 10%. Endurance regen, excluding out of combat bonus regen, is doubled. There is no endurance cost to upkeep this stance. And then something it doesn't say on here is that when you're out of combat, once you get finished fighting, it'll give you on your health bar a little like indicator. It looks like an hourglass or something like that, and a timer countdown. Whenever you get the green dot showing that you are out of combat, you automatically get the benefits of the balance stance. And same thing will go for the recovery stance down here, or the recovery invocation. So I'll go over that when I get down to it, but just kind of a real nice quality of life feature I found, so I wasn't having to stance as much as I originally was before I realized that. So getting it automatically is pretty nice in between the fights. So really, it's when I was using this was mostly when I was in combat. I would be using like one of these other stances I'll go over soon, like Berserker or Striker or Offensive. And once you got down low, what's cool about this is you always get the increased chance to hit by 10% and the damage reduced by 10%. So if you're in one of the other stances and you find your stamina is getting down to about the 10% areas, when I typically would try to stance into it, it lets you get an opportunity to regen up. So pretty nice. Tells you who the classes are that gets it: Berserker, Bard, Beast Lord, Monk, Paladin, Ranger, Rogue, Shadow Knight, Warrior here. So pretty much all the melee classes are getting that. Next one on the list here is the Berserker stance. While this stance is active, attack speed and combat skill recharge rate is doubled, and your chance to hit and combat skill damage is increased by 25%. Every point of damage dealt consumes half that amount in endurance, with a reduction based on your strategy skill. You also take 8.3 of outgoing damage to yourself. Bonus damage from critical hits and similar effects do not cost endurance. So this one is kind of a bread and butter for the Berserkers. This is the stance that I almost always was using for the Berserker. I tried a few of them out, and I found that the Berserker stance is just really pretty nice. The key, other than what it states here, the fact that it has attack speed and combat skilled recharge rate doubled, and the chance to hit and combat skill damage increased by 25%. That's huge. What it also says it without saying it is that there is no drop-off like on the offensive stance. So you can run this all the way down to 0 on your endurance, and when you get under 10%, it still gives you the full damage increase and, essentially all of the attack speed and everything. It doesn't get diminished as your endurance pool reduces. What it does do, though, is if you don't have enough endurance to do the attack, like if you're basically at 0 and you do an attack, it will not give you the benefits anymore. So you won't get the attack speed double and the recharge rate double or the increased damage from what I saw playtesting into the game. So it's like, at that point, if you're at 0, you might as well switch over to balance stance, because that would give you the full maximum benefit of balance. So that's only if it's a long fight, you've totally zeroed out, and you still need to keep going. So there's always options based on how you play, of course, but that's what I found. The biggest thing I saw for people using this would be the skill recharge rate being doubled. So that's going to affect things like, the very biggest ones that people talk about right now is the Paladin Smite and the Shadow Knight's Reeve skill. Basically, those skills reduce the cooldowns of Lay on Hands or Harm's Touch for the Paladins and the Shadow Knights by a minute every time they hit. So they have, costs and stuff into that. I can cover those more when I talk about those classes, but basically having the skill combat recharge rate doubled lets you reduce the cooldown on those things twice as much. And then those attacks can, double and triple attack. So, having a Berserker in the combo with Paladins and Shadow Knights is really strong for that synergy. Other classes that it works really well with would be things like Monks, because they have flying kicks and dragon punches and all that stuff. All of those are going to be going twice as often. A Rogue's Backstab is going to be coming up twice as often, and a Warrior's Cleave is coming up twice as often. So throwing in Berserker on top of that is just, it really does punch out a lot of damage. As you see, it also says you take 8.3% of that outgoing damage to yourself, which it didn't, there's ways that they offset it on their own with their rune abilities and their AAs, but having something to try to counteract that, some sort of sustain is kind of necessary. So, because the Reeve skill, for instance, for the Shadow Knight also makes you take damage when you use it. So you can find there's a lot of ways to damage yourself if you stack those up. So again, Shadow Knights fix that with their own life steals or whatever, but it's just something to consider. I found it to be a fairly negligible amount of damage, but it's still something to consider. So next up on the list here, and it's all, it says Channeler Stance. All incoming damage is reduced by 40%. So that includes melee and spell damage. And your chance to successfully channel is increased. Half of the mitigated damage is charged to both mana and endurance, with a reduction based on your strategy skill. So this one goes to clerics, druids, enchanters, magicians, necros, shamans, and wizards. So for those pure casters, this is their kind of default to defensive stance. I have seen stuff where it's really useful. Like I had a combination that was enchanter, shaman, necro, and this was the only stance that was available to that combo, and I was basically just staying in it all the time. And when I was getting hit, I didn't notice a enormous drain on my stats. But of course, you know, if you're going up against raid bosses and things like that, you're getting hit hard, it will start to drain both the mana and the endurance. So it's nice when you need it. You can click it off if you had to. If you don't want to lose that mana or endurance, you know, it's, for me, for the casters, it was the mana that typically I would use the most of, but still 40% damage reduction to both baked in, and a higher chance to successfully channel. Very nice. So great stance there. Next up, for the defensive, all incoming melee damage is reduced by 50%, and incoming magical damage is reduced by 20%. Every point of damage reduced consumes an equal amount of endurance, with a reduction based on your strategy skill. So that one only drains the endurance at a 1-to-1 ratio versus like the Channeler, which is splitting it half and half. This one goes to Paladins, Shadow Knights, and Warriors as the tank classes. So super nice stance, especially for those guys when they're tanking raid bosses and things like that. It's, you know, the name of the game is you're watching your endurance. You know, typically I would be switching between that and like the balanced stance when I need to regen. And then depending on your combo, you might be switching between that and like an offensive stance or something when you're not taking the big hits or you're not worried about it. So very nice tank option. You know, 50% of all melee damage is huge. So next up, they've got the evasive stance, and you have a 95% chance to evade all incoming attacks. Every point of damage evaded consumes 2 endurance, with a reduction based on your strategy skill. Evasion will fail if you have insufficient endurance or while playing dead. I think it's worth mentioning too with these things, anything you evade naturally from your skills doesn't get a hit to the endurance. So if you pass the check to dodge something or whatever before, then it works just like a normal, like you were in any other stance. But then if you're in evasion and it would have hit you, you now have a 95% chance. So it's not 100. Hits will still get through sometimes, but 95 is basically huge on this one. And it'll start to kind of chunk away at your endurance. So depending on how your evasion stance is, you know, how your evasion stat is on your character sheet, you'll see this either really burn it very fast or be actually pretty sustainable. But you'll have to build it up in between. You know, it's one of those things. I found this stance to be one of the fastest ways to absolutely drain my endurance bar out of all of them. But it's a really good skill to have for the bards to get it. Monks, rangers get it, which is nice. Beast lords and rogues. So this is one I would use a lot. You know, if I was getting down into critical levels and something was beating you up, pop an evasion, you got a 95% chance to just recover, essentially get your feet back under you, whatever, hit a heal, do what you got to do. So super nice. Next up, Mage Hunter. All incoming spell damage is reduced by 50%, and incoming physical damage is reduced by 20%. Every point of damage reduced consumes an equal amount of endurance, with a reduction based on your strategy skill. So it's like the parallel to defensive, but for spell damage. So if you know you're going to be taking a lot of spell damage, if you're dotted up, things like that, this one can help sustain you through that. You know, but also still give you that 20% physical. So same thing like with the defensive, which also gives you the 20% magical. So it's just kind of the opposite. This one goes to Berserkers, Paladins, and Shadow Knights only. So no warrior on that list. Good stance, nice for killing casters. Basically what I would typically use that would be like when I was up against a caster full on mana, and I would just weather the storm of their casts, and then if they were out of mana, I might switch to offensive or something, or even just defensive, to try to mitigate as much damage as possible. It just depends on how the fight's going and what you're doing. So nice option to have. I found it also kind of had a lot of overlap with the defensive, because even though they're a caster nuking you, they're not they're still getting the melee damage in. So you kind of have to, play each fight by ear, depending on like what difficulty you're on. They might be a caster and a melee guy, like Kha'Zix might have a wizard class on him. So it's just a matter of adapting to the situation that's provided to you. So next one up is offensive stance. Outgoing melee damage is increased by 100%, and your chance to hit is increased by 25%. Each point of bonus damage dealt consumes an equal amount of endurance, with a reduction based on your strategy skill. And then when below 25% endurance, the chance to hit bonus is reduced based on the remaining percent of endurance. So bonus damage from critical hits and similar effects do not cost endurance. This one goes to all the melee guys, basically. Berserker, Bard, Beast Lord, Monk, Paladin, Ranger, Rogue, Shadow Knight, Warrior. So this is what I was typically in. I tried to play test it versus some of the other ones like Striker. And the biggest caveat I found was this negative side effect here. When below 25% endurance, the chance to hit is reduced based on the remaining percent of endurance. So like if you're at 24%, you only have a 24% chance to hit, is how I read that. So the way I would play it would be, since offensive or balanced stance up here always gives you 10% reduction of damage and 10% chance to hit, it doesn't give you the 100% damage increase, but if you're running out of the endurance, you don't get it anyways, right? So when I'd hit about 10%, typically I'd switch over, or if the fight was kind of getting close to being done and I just wanted to get a jump start on regenning, it's a very effective skill. Your white damage is just twice as hard. It's really nice. So I found that this was kind of what I used if I did not have the Berserk stance, which did not diminish when below the 25% radius. So pretty interesting. So good stance right there. Next up was the range stance. Your ranged attack has no minimum distance, gains a 25% accuracy bonus, and can double and triple attack. Every point of damage consumes endurance, with a reduction based on your strategy skill. So I did run a ranger up to level 50, and I was trying some strategies with the ranged stance. And essentially, from my experience, was what this has is a 25% accuracy bonus, which is nice. The double and triple attack is nice, but when I was using it, it didn't really. I could out regen my energy, my endurance, faster than range stance could drain it. So versus like if I was using Berserk or offensive, those would just drain my endurance. Typically in a fight, I could see it, but with ranged, it would not. So that might be a good thing, in your opinion, if you're trying to save the endurance up for if you get aggro and you want to pop into like an evasive stance, because rangers get the evasive, for instance. That might be part of your strategy, and that's kind of how I was playing my ranger. Was I would have a pet in there tanking, and I would stay back at ranged, and that way the monster wouldn't turn and aggro on me. I could still cast spells, and in between the spells hit them with ranged attacks. So it was pretty nice. I liked doing that, but I found as far as the damage side of it, it did not compete with doing like a melee offensive stance. Is just what I've typically found. Those melee damage typically did more. So this is one of those stances I would like to see it do more personally. I think it's a very interesting, fun way of building your guy out to be ranged. There's lots of suggestions that I've seen. Whether or not anybody's going to do that, it's up to them. There's a lot of ways. I mean, even if you just had like some sort of a damage bonus in there as well as the accuracy is nice. Like rangers have a lot of accuracy things built into their kit as permanent buffs that they hit. So, but there's a lot of discussion, let's just say, where like the ranged attack doesn't proc your melee abilities and stuff like that. So, you know, it has its own proc stuff on there, of course. So it's an interesting thing. I like it. I found it to be less efficient than just melee, but if that's what you're going for, this is the stance to use there. A lot of people typically would go with, like, if they had a berserker, they would go with the berserker stance over the ranged stance and do more damage, is what I was hearing. I haven't tried that, but it's what I have heard seems to be better, you know, but of course the ranged gives you the double and triple attacks, which I did see happening a lot. So it's one of those, if you're a ranger, it's something to use. Next up, striker. Outgoing weapon skill abilities deal 3x damage, and non-weapon skill abilities deal 5x damage, and your chance to hit is increased by 25%. Each point of damage dealt consumes an equal amount of endurance, with a reduction based on your strategy skill. When below 25% endurance, the chance to hit bonus is reduced based on the remaining percent of endurance. Bonus damage from critical hits and similar effects do not cost endurance. And classes that get this would be the Berserker, Monk, Rogue, Warrior. I used Striker Stance a lot to try to get a comparison between it and, like, offensive. And what I had found was that the Striker Stance would use my endurance faster, which told me that it was doing more damage. Like, the combo I specifically had would be like Monk, Paladin, and Enchanter. So with the Monk, Paladin, Enchanter going into Striker, it would make all of the Monk's kicks and stuff like that be doing 3x damage. So that would drain my endurance faster than going into offensive stance and letting the white damage hit. But from my experience, that was, you know, and a lot of it comes down to how much you want to micromanage it. But what I found is that the offensive was a good middle ground, kind of like without completely draining your endurance, so that you still had endurance left to go into defensive stance and absorb damage if you needed to, and stuff like that. So, you know, interesting. It really is going to be a playstyle thing there, like how much you want to dance in between different stances and things like that. But the striker was very strong. So, good stance. I found it also affected like reposts to make the repost hit really hard. So, very cool. Nice little skill. So that's going to be all of the stances. They have their own little chart here, but I made my own to kind of include both the stances and the invocations kind of on one list, which I think was kind of helpful. But show it to you there again. I'm going to leave this up towards the end of the video, but you know, one kind of glance that you could look and see all the stances and all the invocations that they get per class. So anyways, yeah, that's the stances so far. And then going back into it, next is going to be a list of all the invocations. So for your casters and stuff like that, here's a list of those. So starting off here would be Arcane Mastery. Spell cast times are reduced by 20% plus 10% per additional intelligence class. The mana cost and detrimental spells is reduced by 10% plus 5% per additional intelligence class. What they don't have listed on here that is in the game would be, oh yeah, it does. It says recovery times there. So spellcast and recovery times reduced by 20% plus 10% per additional intelligence class. So that's going to be pretty much the classes that get it. Enchanters, mages, necromancers, shadow knights, and wizards. So it's interesting there. Shadow knights add to that. So it's kind of a fascinating thing that you can get into on there. I really liked this invocation. I call them stances all the time, so if I do that, forgive me. Know that I mean invocation. But the way I looked at this was there is no negative penalty to using this. Spellcast times and recovery times, so reduced by 10% or 20% plus 10 per additional. So, and then the mana cost reduced as well. So basically, I was looking at it as a 20% DPS increase because you're able to get the spells out that much faster, and a mana reduction, so you're that much more efficient. So I would even use those to cast my spells like Prayer, Promised Renewal, because it helps with the recovery times. So when you have like a 14-second recast on a spell, you might be able to get it back faster, so you could put a Promised Renewal on somebody else. Like if I was healing my pet, I could then put a heal on myself faster, and then the mana reduction on top of that, pretty nice. So it's also was really nice for like putting dots out. I'd want to put multiple dots on things, or hit them with a Tashinas or a Malo and then start my dots. Well, this just let me get through the rotation faster, which, depending on the difficulty that you're fighting or whatever, I found it to be useful. So next up is going to be this Divine Stance. Spending mana will heal the group member with the lowest HP percentage by that amount. For every additional Wisdom class, this will repeat with a heal for 33% of the mana spent. So they have updated this recently at the end of the pre-order to include pets into the group members. So it prioritizes players over pets. So I can't remember exactly the ratio, but it was something like if your pet was 40% lower than you, so if I'm at 60% and he's at 20%, then it would give it to, it would start to heal the pet, but it would prioritize players by a lot. So kind of a nice little thing on there. Typically I found, and it's just a pure benefit. So at low levels, like I was playing the Ranger and leveling up the Ranger, and I didn't have a heal class other than the Ranger, I would use whatever my biggest mana spell was, which at the low levels was the permanent buff Hawkeye or something like that. It cost 100 mana, and it would heal me up for more than what his level 10 heal was. So yeah, it just saved me time of having to cast a ton of minor heals. I would just cast whatever my largest mana spender was, be in Divine Stance, and it was a good heal. So nice ability. This goes to the Beast Lords, Clerics, Druids, Paladins, Rangers, and Shamans. So nice skill. Most of the time I would end up using that out of combat to heal myself up in between fights. If I was in the fight, I would usually do something like an inversion or something to try to cast the spell real fast and not get stunned while I was casting it. But there were times when I was playing with a group of people, and if I was taking on the role of trying to heal, this is just adding bigger heals onto there. It's everything you'd want. So very nice, useful, good invocation all around. Next up is Empower. Empower adds 20% plus 10% per additional non-hybrid casting class to damage effects at the cost of 20% more mana. Adds 10% plus 5% per additional non-hybrid casting class to healing effects at the cost of 10% more mana. So in this case, the way I look at this is it adds, we'll just kind of go with the base 20% to your damage at the cost of 20% more mana. And then for the healing, adds 10% at the cost of 10% more mana. So, this one, I played around with it, and I like it. If you need to burn something down, you want to hit something really hard, this is nice. But the way I kind of did the math in my head was, if you're looking at a 20% increase at the cost of 20% more mana, I opted to run the Arcane Mastery over it typically, which was 20% faster casting and 20% faster recovery, which, not every spell has a recovery, but 20% faster casting and a mana reduction versus a mana increase. So typically that's where I would go with the Arcane Mastery when it was available, if I had it in my combo, if that makes sense. But there are times that this is going to outshine it. Like for instance, it's non-hybrid casting class instead of just additional intelligence class. So if you're running a bunch of wisdom casters, you know, this might end up being more and let you hit really hard, but at the cost of more mana. So it just kind of play test it, see what you think. Like some combos I wasn't having mana issues, so if that doesn't really matter to you, then the negative effects are inconsequential almost, if that makes sense. So nuking hard is nuking hard. When you look at the additional healing, so let's say 10% at the cost of 10% more mana, well, Divine Stance for me almost outshines that, because you're getting 33% more efficient healing, but that's also going based on the mana spent instead of on the raw healing of the spell. So I haven't crunched all those numbers completely to see, you know, which one really ends up shining. It's good. I didn't have all the time with the pre-order time limits, so I found myself typically going to opt for faster was better, because it's less chance to get interrupted, monsters were stunning you and stuff like that. But that's all. The experience in live is going to be different than my experiences in the pre-order. You know, it's just they're always making changes. So next up was inversion. It says it shifts 2/3 of spellcast time into the global recovery time and 20% of the mana cost into half as much in endurance cost. So I might have forgotten to go over which ones were for the empower. You know, it says here cleric, druid, enchanter, mage, necro, shaman, wizard. So this one goes, yeah, the inversion, which shifts 2/3 of the spell cost. I think I just made that confusing. So the classes I just listed were for the empowered stance, not the inversion. The inversion, which says shifts 2/3 of the spell cast time into the global recovery time and 20% of the mana cost into half as much in endurance, goes for bards, beast lords, paladins, clerics, druids, enchanters, mages, necros, rangers, shadow knights, shamans, and wizards. So almost everybody that has mana. This one I used a lot, especially with my characters that were in there doing melee damage, or even like, for instance, the ranger as he's shooting bow shots. I found inversion to be a really nice option because it shifts 2/3 of the spell cast time into the global recovery and 20% of the mana cost into half as much in endurance cost. So it's doing two things. It's reducing the amount of mana that it costs that spell, which ended up being, 20% is a lot, but you pay that in half as much as endurance, and then you cast it 2/3 faster, so 66% faster. So, as far as math goes, Arcane Mastery, you're doing like 30% faster, maybe 40% if you've got all intelligence casters, you know what I mean? But with this 60%, it just the spell comes out really fast. You have to wait for a while for the global recovery time, so it's like you cannot cast any other spells while you're waiting. So it ends up actually being the same amount of time per spell, but your economy of time is better as far as you can still melee, you can still shoot your bow, you're less susceptible to stuns and things like that. So I used this stance a lot. One of the things, like for healing myself as a paladin, for instance, like I would just whip the heal out, it was nice and good enough for me to sustain through fights and things like that while, my lay on hands was coming back off cooldown or whatever, So really nice, very, very cool ability. I think I liked this one. One of the sneaky things I found that I hadn't considered much, that I found through playtesting it, was 20% of the mana cost is being turned into, with, I guess, 10% of the mana cost, I suppose, is turning into an endurance cost. So you get like 20% less mana, but half of that mana you save, 10%, is turning into endurance. So when I was running my Paladin, Monk, Enchanter, for instance, endurance was a premium. As I kind of went over on the others, the stances, you'd be in offensive stance a lot of the time, is what I found myself to be in. But if I got to a point where I needed to switch over to defensive to take some hits, regen some mana, whatever, staying in this stance and casting stuff non-stop hurts your endurance. So when I was using the stance to nuke and cast my just cast a bunch of my enchanter stun, the nuke that they get, it's like Discordant Mind or something, I would almost chain cast that on easier fights just to do more damage, right? Well, what I found was that used more endurance. So if I was going for like a sustained fight, like going chain pulling, doing multiple fights back to back to back to back, I would eventually have to stop and regen my endurance. Because like the mana was really good from the enchanter, but my endurance, I didn't find ways to recover my endurance as well. So eventually I might have to wait for a minute or two in between fights just to let the endurance catch up, or fight in balanced stance. There's all kinds of different ways you can skin that cat, but it's just something I started to recognize was this is turning into an endurance cost. So how much DPS would I have been losing out on if I could have stayed in offensive stance longer? Just as something to think about. Now, that doesn't mean I love this stance. I was in it a lot because if I want to cast a heal, I just cast the heal. I don't have to worry about them casting a stun on me halfway through a long heal cast. It doesn't interrupt my white damage, things like that. I'm specifically kind of talking about nuking just for the sake of doing more damage. And straight comparing that to like, well, would I rather nuke for more damage and lose some endurance, or stay in offensive stance longer? So just something to kind of consider. An interesting side note I thought I'd put on there. So next up is the inviolable stance. I hope I'm saying that right. I'm sure we can find a bunch of ways to say that. Inviolable? It's a fun one. Inviolable is what I say. So cast spells are uninterruptible at the cost of 100% more mana and the same amount as endurance. So essentially, if you have a spell that you need to cast, must cast, want to get off no matter what, this is going to make it uninterruptible. And I'd imagine a stun might still stop you, but you have AAs to help finish off a cast even if you get stunned. I didn't get the chance to test that part of this. If like somebody stuns you while you're casting, is it still uninterruptible? But what I did get to see with this, and this one goes to bards and wizards, what I did get to see with this is that you can completely run at full speed all across and still get your spells to cast. So essentially, like in live, bards would do swarm kiting because they could run so fast. This lets you cast spells while you're full speed running and get them to land. For instance, like if you've got dots from the shaman or something and you want to cast your curse on a guy, well, you can engage and then run and still be able to land curses and snares and roots and stuff like that. So it's a very cool utility of that. Unfortunately, most of the gameplay I found myself doing was in dungeons and things like that. So I didn't find much of a need to do kiting because I was a healer and a tank as well. So I could just face tank and avoid that problem altogether. And the number one spell that NPCs love to cast on you first and foremost, if they have it in their toolkit, they're going to hit you with it the first thing out the gate, is root. You're just going to get rooted all the time. They are working on that, I believe, so they're changing it so spellcasters cast their damage more than they cast their CC things. So that's something I hope that they do, just out of it makes more sense to me that a monster with an ice comet would rather ice comet me than root me, because most of the time I'm not running away, but it's in their repertoire. I mean, they did a good job. I understand it. If you have the ability to root somebody and slow somebody and stun somebody, and they're not currently rooted, slowed, or stunned, then it's high on the priority list to get those things off. So, anyway, an interesting skill. Pretty niche, I think, but fun. Yeah, I like the fun factor of it. Just the thoughts of a bard running full speed, nuking ice comets without stopping. I freaking like it. Alright, so next up, Overchannel. Cast spells have a minus 150 resist adjust plus another minus 15 for every non-hybrid caster class at the cost of 10% of the mana cost in endurance. This one is for bards, beast lords, paladins, clerics, druids, enchanters, magicians, necromancers, rangers, shadow knights, shamans, and wizards. So this one's just huge. Overchannel is fantastic. I used this one a lot, especially on my enchanter to get slows to hit for the charms and stuff like that. It made it just kind of work better all around. Something to kind of note, it specifically says a non-hybrid caster class in here. So there are classes in the list, such as Shadow Knight, Bards, Beast Lords, Paladins, etc., that get access to Overchannel that don't necessarily give it the additional minus 15 per non-hybrid caster part. So they'll get the original 150, but if you're not running a pure caster class, such as the druids, clerics, the int casters necros and wizards and stuff like that, then those are the only pure caster classes, essentially, that are going to get that minus 15 extra. So I guess it'd be easier to say the classes that don't add an additional minus 15 would be things like the Bard, the Beast Lord, the Paladin, the Ranger, and the Shadow Knight. There's other classes besides that, but those are classes with mana. So the other classes, getting a combo with for instance, a Shaman, a Wizard, and a Druid, you're going to get the 150 plus an additional 30. Because it's, well, it might be 45 based on the wording here. I'd have to read the in-game tooltip because I thought it said plus an additional per additional. But anyway, 30 or 45, either way, huge. So that, that's a lot of negative to their resist modifier. So I found that it really helped for landing things like slows on raid bosses and in the plane of sky and stuff. The cost of the 10% of mana cost in endurance is completely worth it, especially if you're a heavy caster in those situations. But even when I was running like a monk that wants the endurance, landing that slow is critical. You know what I mean? So very, very good. I would use it for things like dots that didn't have a baked in resist threat shredder. So an example I could say is the necromancers get boil blood, and it has like a minus 200 to their fire resist baked into that spell. So that spell I didn't necessarily need to do Overchannel to cast, but other things like the enchanter's choke line, I needed to cast this because it gets resisted all the time. So I would typically be in Overchannel to make sure those spells landed, just because I didn't want to recast it multiple times and burn mana, if that makes sense. So it all comes down to playstyle, but this is one that I found that I used all the time. Next up is the recovery stance. You regenerate mana twice as fast, and spells have a 5% reduced mana cost. Out of combat regen bonus is not affected. While out of combat, the regeneration modifier of this invocation is active, even if this invocation is not. So similar to the balanced stance up there for For the stances, the recovery invocation would give you that, even if this invocation is not. So, interesting that it states that there. I would triple check on the in-game, and again, it's all beta, pre-order stuff, so it's subject to change. Triple check the wording on this in-game, that it says that you still, get the, for the balance stance, make sure it says that it's active even if that stance is not for the regen. I found that it was. Triple check on that for me because I can't currently get in the game to look at that. So recovery is just super nice, not having to stance it essentially is what it comes down to. But so essentially what it is saying though is that you regenerate mana twice as fast, but it does not double your out of combat mana regen. So it's basically your regen coming from like clarity and things like that. It's going to help you in combat to regenerate twice as fast, but if you're out, the out of combat number basically is always that number. When you're out of combat, whether this stance is active or not, you get the maximum out of combat regen from just the base of that, but it will still regenerate more mana from things like clarity in combat. So with an added bonus of the 5% reduction to mana cost, which is not nothing. It's kind of nice. So classes that get this are the Bard, Beast Lord, Paladin, Cleric, Druid, Enchanter, Mage, Necro, Ranger, Shadow Knight, Shaman, Wizard. And I would find myself being in this in combat a lot when I had nothing to do. So I would default, typically I would go into this if I was not planning to cast anything for a long time, just so I could get several ticks of better mana regen, and then switch into the stance that I needed when it was time to cast a dot or something. I could switch over to the over channel, or if I was going to cast a heal, I would go into like the inversion or something and just cast the heal real fast. So, next up, you got Spellblade. It treats the first spell gem slot as a proc that consumes both mana and endurance on activation. 40% of the spell's mana cost is paid as mana, and 20% as endurance. This spell must have a reuse time less than or equal to its cast time. So classes that get that would be the Beast Lord, Paladin, Ranger, and Shadow Knight. This spell blade is an interesting one. I like the flavor of this spell a lot, or this invocation a lot. It doesn't proc as much as I would have hoped it would. And from things I learned reading up on it from other people in the wiki who had play tested it, and from using it in game, my experience was that things that had a lower mana cost procced more. So using earlier level spells and stuff, you could get it to proc more often. Things that had really higher mana costs would proc less. The other thing, it would be affected by a lot of the other decks, things that would help you to proc more, like any proc rate. But what was fascinating when I would use this, typically I would find I would just use inversion over this like 99% of the time, because if I wanted to have something casting, I would rather just over channel it and make sure it lands, or inversion it and cast it a lot, because you can, if you're getting 3 or 4 procs per minute, well, I can cast a lot more inverted spells in that minute than I could from just letting Spellblade rock. But when I would use Spellblade would be if I just was mindlessly farming stuff and I didn't want to interrupt. That's the big benefit of this, is it doesn't interrupt your white damage to proc. It just happens. So there is a benefit there, but if you're good at doing the inverted stance, you can time it in between your weapon swings and not interrupt your white damage as well. So when I typically would use this was if I was just kind of killing something that wasn't really a critical fight. I can just turn this on and let it proc. You know, if it happens, it happens. It's a nice bonus. If it never happened, I didn't need it anyway, sort of a thing. But one of the things I tried to kind of be conscious of was it does say it procs at the cost of 40% of the spell's mana and 20% of the mana cost as endurance. So if you had a spell that cost, you know, say 100% mana, well, 40% of it would be mana and 20% of it would be endurance, for a total cost of basically 60% of the original cost is being paid. So you're getting like a 40% reduction in the cost. So and then if you kind of dig into it even deeper, you're actually getting a 60% mana reduction, but a 20% endurance increase. So, or, you know, if that kind of makes sense. So, you know, it'll cost some endurance that you wouldn't otherwise have had, but it will save on mana. So I kind of liked it for that idea of, you know, if you weren't burning through endurance, but that's typically what I found, is that the endurance was the pain point. It was kind of like what I found myself needing to regen out of combat and wait for the most would be endurance. So an interesting thing, this last part, that the spell cast time has to be less, or sorry, the reuse time has to be less than or equal to the cast time. That's at the base level. So if you have focus effects and things like that that increase your haste of the spell, so it's like a faster cast, I never found anything that affected it to that point, but it's just so you guys know, it's the base level of the spell. This would get interesting for things like the Druid AoEs. They have no reuse timer, so you know it takes like 2 seconds to cast it, and it can be reused again right away. So this goes into there. A lot of people would use it for heals and stuff like that, you know, just to do sustain healing in between fights. They don't have to think about it. I would use it for nukes, you know, but I'd considered it for dots and stuff like that because the proc rate was low, but typically I found myself not using this very much. So on to the last one here. It's the Unyielding Stance, and this says health regen excluding out of combat damage regen is doubled, with a 25% resistance increase to loss of control from Fear, Mez, and Charm. There is no mana cost to upkeep this stance. And this one goes to Berserkers, Monks, Rogues, and Warriors. So this one I found is interesting because, like, if you're playing an Ixar or a Troll, or you have like the Rubicite Breastplate, that will increase your health regen and double it. I tried it with things like the spells that are like regenerate, because that does give you like a regen, but it did not affect the number I saw on my character sheet when I switched into an Unyielding Stance. So that's something that I thought would be an interesting effect that would be nice, like if you have a druid or something that's casting a lot of the heal over times that are kind of like a regen. They did not count that as health regen on that. So from what I saw, like again, a lot of these things can change when it goes live. You know, take everything, always do your own testing to double check on things because stuff could change, you know, but that's just what I found in the pre-order beta. But what it did work really well for was when I re-rolled a combo and I had like the Rubicite Breastplate and I was low level. I didn't have really any other invocations that I wanted to use. This just let my health regen kind of go nuts in between fights so I could sustain through. And then with a sneaky added benefit of a 25% resist increase to loss of control effects from Fear, Mez, and Charm, which if you've done any grouping in this and monsters fear bomb you, it can really mess up a pull. You know, if you're running across the whole zone from fear, or some wipes I experienced was, you know, we're fighting, a guy gets feared, and then another guy gets charmed. You know what I mean? And it goes from us having a 3-on-3 battle to a 1-on-3 with one of my friends hitting me too. So this is a nice way to try to resist those things. If you see there's like a bard or an enchanter in the enemy lineup, if there's a necromancer that's going to fear you, you get AAs as you progress through the game that help make you have a lower chance to be, like, you can essentially get immune to most fears, but you can't get immune to charms and mezzes. But with this extra 25%, you can, from what I saw. So, you know, a lot of things don't mez you if you're the only one fighting, which is thank goodness. But if you have a group and there is something that can mez you, they will do it, and it is a learning experience for sure. So this is really nice for that. Nice at lower levels for that health regen. Typically when I got up into higher levels, I would use something like the inversion stance and just cast heals and rely on that more. But again, the increased chance to resist fears, mezzes, and charms is super duper nice. So that's kind of a big high level overview. I just wanted to kind of go over those things, get that talked about. So if I kind of go through other videos and stuff, that has a really good reference point for everyone to look at and know my in-game experience, kind of giving my 2 cents on what I found. So I've got this little spreadsheet here showing everything that you kind of get, so that y'all could pause the video, take a screenshot of this or whatever, and see, you know, as a bard, for instance, you're going to get the balanced, the evasive, and the offensive stance, and then you're also going to get the invaluable, inversion, overchannel, and recovery invocations. So something for, you know, whatever class combos you're going to do, you could kind of look and see, oh, you know, this is what I'm getting. Like, for instance, I played a paladin, monk, enchanter a lot. You know, it's a good combo. It worked out well. I also would do like the paladin, monk, berserker, stuff like that. But just to kind of keep things simple, I went, let's say I was a paladin, a monk, an enchanter. So I can look and see here, I'm going to get the channeler from the enchanter, arcane mastery, the empowering, the inversion, the overchannel, and the recovery from enchanter. The monk is going to bring in balanced, evasive, offensive, ranged, and striker, as well as an unyielding invocation. And then from paladin you get balanced, defensive, mage hunter, offensive, as well as the divine, the inversion, overchannel, recovery, and spellblade. So ultimately that kind of gives you a list of channeler, balanced, evasive, offensive, ranged striker, defensive, and mage hunter. And then for the invocation side, you'd have like arcane mastery, empowering, inversion, overchannel, recovery, unyielding, and divine, and spellblade. So that's quite a long list. And they have their own bar that they give you, but thankfully you also have an abilities page when you're in the game that you can pull up and look and see. It'll tell you and show you all of the stances and invocations that your character currently has for your loadout, so that you can drag those buttons and make them, you know, specific. So if you find yourself always using the same few buttons, you can make them hotkeys or whatever. That's what I ended up doing, was having a bar that I used rather than their standard, because I wanted the order of them in a specific way. I wanted like my defenses all together, so if I wanted to be in channelers, or, you know, so I had my channelers, my evasive, my defensive, and my mage hunter all together in one spot, so I didn't have to hunt for it, you know what I mean? If I needed to go into one, I would. Anyway, just, you know, and the same thing for like the strikers and the balanced and stuff. I put that together, so it was just a little easier, and then I hotkey stuff. So I put the hotkeys on there so that I could press a button to switch, and it was just nice to be able to put hotkeys to it. You can also macro all of these. So when you're in the game and you want to set it up so like when I start attack, I automatically go into offensive, you can. So that's everything there for you. Thank you all for listening to it, making it to the end. I appreciate y'all. Have a good one.